October 14th, 1957, Idlewild Airport, New York. The fountain pen shook slightly as Dr. Heinrich Bauer adjusted his glasses and wrote in his notebook, careful to keep his thoughts neutral in case American eyes ever saw the pages. The Americans must be heading for disaster. No nation could encourage this much borrowing and remain stable. Back home in Frankfurt, the scars of Weimar were still fresh. Savings erased, wages worthless, democracy destroyed by inflation. Yet here, in the country, Germany's economists had warned about for a decade, shop windows overflowed with televisions, cars, refrigerators, all available on credit. To men shaped by collapse, it looked less like prosperity and more like sorcery. February 3rd, 1952, Frankfurt, West Germany. The ink froze for a moment in the nib of Dr. Heinrich Bauer's pen as he drafted a confidential memo to his colleagues at the University of Frankfurt. Outside his window, construction crews worked to rebuild what Allied bombs had flattened 7 years earlier. The sound of hammers and cement mixers had become the constant soundtrack of the new Germany. Bauer was writing about America, specifically about the dangerous expansion of consumer credit he'd been tracking through economic journals and Federal Reserve publications. The numbers made his hands cold. American household debt has doubled since 1945, he wrote. Consumer credit outstanding now exceeds $15 billion. This is not economic growth. This is the prelude to catastrophe. For men like Bauer, born in 1908, debt meant only one thing: destruction. He had been a young economics student in 1923, when Germany's currency collapsed. He remembered his professor arriving at the lecture hall with a wheelbarrow full of marks, just to buy lunch. He remembered his mother weeping when her life savings became worthless overnight. A single egg cost billions of marks. Wages paid twice daily became worthless by evening. But the economic devastation was only half the story. The social destruction was worse. Bauer had watched the Weimar Republic, the democratic government born from World War I's ashes, crumble under the weight of worthless money. Extremists on both sides gained followers. People who had lived stable, moral lives became desperate. By 1933, the chaos had opened the door to something far darker than inflation. The Great Depression had reinforced every lesson. When Bauer studied at the London School of Economics in 1931, he saw unemployment lines stretching for blocks. He watched British and American banks fail. He learned that credit bubbles always eventually burst. Now, in 1952, 7 years after Germany's second collapse in a generation, Bauer sat in a partially rebuilt office and tried to understand why America seemed to be repeating every mistake his country had made. The contrast couldn't have been starker. Germany in 1952 was a country of ruins and ration cards. The currency reform of 1948 had given West Germany the Deutsche Mark, a currency backed by discipline and fear. The Bundesbank, Germany's new central bank, operated with one commandment above all others: never again. Never again would German money become worthless. Never again would inflation destroy savings. Never again would easy credit lead to collapse. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, something impossible was happening. American newspapers and magazines arrived in Frankfurt weeks late, but their glossy pages told an astonishing story. Department stores advertised refrigerators for no money down. Car dealerships offered 5-year payment plans. Developers were building entire towns of houses that ordinary workers could buy with tiny down payments and 30-year mortgages. Bauer collected these advertisements like a pathologist collecting disease samples. Each one represented to him another step toward inevitable catastrophe. His colleague, Dr. Werner Hoffmann, was less certain. Hoffmann had worked briefly with the Allied occupation authorities after the war and had spent time observing American economic officers. Perhaps, Hoffmann suggested during their regular Friday lunch, they have learned to manage what we could not. Bauer's response was sharp. No one manages their way out of mathematics, Werner. When the music stops, the debt remains. We learned this. Why haven't they? But even Bauer had to admit that the catastrophe he predicted kept not happening. American GDP grew. Unemployment stayed low. The depression everyone expected after wartime production ended never materialized. Instead, America entered what its citizens were calling the post-war boom. By 1955, the mystery had become too large to ignore. The Bundesbank, working with the Bank for International Settlements and the newly formed International Monetary Fund, began arranging academic exchanges. Central bankers needed to understand each other's systems. The dollar was now the world's reserve currency, whether Germans liked it or not. Understanding American monetary policy wasn't optional. Dr. Heinrich Bauer received his invitation in March 1955. He would join a small delegation of German economists on a 3-month study tour of the American financial system. They would visit Federal Reserve banks, commercial banks, new suburban developments, and Washington policymakers. Bauer accepted, but his private notes made his expectations clear. We are being sent to observe a slow-motion catastrophe. The only question is whether we will witness the collapse itself, or merely document the conditions that make it inevitable. Before departing, the German delegation met in Frankfurt to establish their research framework. There were 5 of them: Bauer from the university, 2 representatives from the Bundesbank, 1 from the finance ministry, and Dr. Hoffman, who would serve as their liaison with American institutions. Their mandate was simple: understand how the American credit system worked, assess its stability, and determine whether any elements could be adapted to Germany's own rebuilding efforts. What they expected to find was a house of cards held together by post-war optimism and military spending. A bubble waiting to pop. A Weimar in English. One member of the delegation, a younger economist named Klaus Richter, asked the question none of the others wanted to voice. What if we're wrong? What if they've actually found a way to make this work? The silence that followed was long and uncomfortable. Bauer finally answered, "Then we must understand how. Because if America has discovered how to build prosperity on debt, the entire foundation of economic theory will need to be rewritten." On June 12, 1955, 5 German economists boarded a Pan Am flight from Frankfurt to New York. None of them could sleep during the crossing. They were flying towards something that shouldn't exist, a country that had turned debt into abundance, credit into growth, and borrowing into national power. They were playing with fire, Bauer thought as the plane descended through the clouds toward Idlewild Airport. Our task is to determine whether they know it. The skyline of Manhattan appeared below them, glittering in the late afternoon sun. It looked nothing like the bombed-out cities they'd left behind. It looked like magic. June 12, 1955. Idlewild Airport, New York. 9:47 p.m. Heinrich Bauer stood at the terminal window and stared at a city that didn't sleep, and apparently didn't need to. Manhattan blazed in the distance like a galaxy that had fallen to Earth. Neon signs advertised everything: banks, cameras, cigarettes, vacations. Broadway glowed. The Empire State Building stood floodlit against the night sky. Werner Hoffmann stood beside him, equally transfixed. "Frankfurt has a curfew because we can't afford the electricity," he murmured. "They light up the night sky for advertisements." The taxi ride into Manhattan only deepened their disorientation. The driver, who spoke cheerfully about the Yankees, his new television, and the house he was buying in Queens, represented their first encounter with American consumer confidence. When Hoffman asked how he could afford a house on a taxi driver's salary, the man laughed. "Afford it? Buddy, nobody affords anything. You make payments. 30 years at 4.5%. My father saved his whole life and never owned a house. Me, I signed papers and moved in the next month." Bauer and Hoffman exchanged glances in the back seat. The mathematics of that transaction would occupy them for weeks. The delegation spent their first 3 days in structured meetings with Federal Reserve officials in New York. But the real education happened in the spaces between. Walking through midtown department stores, watching shoppers on Fifth Avenue, reading the financial pages of American newspapers over breakfast. Everything was bigger than expected, and everything was for sale on terms. On their 4th day, the delegation was driven to Levittown, Pennsylvania, one of the massive suburban developments that had become synonymous with post-war American prosperity. 17,000 homes, built in 4 years, sold to young families who'd made down payments of just 10%. Their guide was Robert Morrison, a vice president at the bank that had financed the development. He was proud, almost evangelical, about what they'd accomplished. "Gentlemen," Morrison began as they drove through streets named after trees, "what you're seeing is the largest home financing operation in human history. Before the war, working-class families rented. Now they own. That's not just an economic change, that's a social revolution." Bauer watched identical houses roll past the car window, white Cape Cods with small lawns, driveways, and young trees planted in careful rows. Children played in yards, women pushed strollers, men washed cars on Saturday morning. It looked orderly, normal, safe. It also looked mathematically impossible. Morrison walked them through a model home, 3 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen with new appliances, a living room with a television. The furniture was included in the purchase price. Total cost, $8,000, Morrison explained. Down payment, $800. Monthly mortgage, $60 for 30 years. Add another $30 for taxes and insurance. Total, $90 a month. Klaus Richter, the youngest of the German delegation, did the math aloud. "That's over $1,000 per year. For 30 years. The buyer will pay nearly $32,000 for an $8,000 house." Morrison smiled. "That's correct. But here's what matters. $90 a month is affordable for a factory worker making $4,000 a year. He gets a house. We get steady returns. The construction company gets steady business. The appliance makers get customers. Everyone wins. Until the factory worker loses his job," Bauer said quietly. Morrison's smile didn't waver. "We've calculated the risk. Delinquency rates on FHA-insured mortgages run below 2%. The system is sound." Over lunch in the Levittown Community Center, Morrison introduced them to a typical young family, the Hendersons. Jim Henderson worked as an electrician at a nearby plant. His wife Sarah stayed home with their 2 children. They'd moved into their Levittown house 8 months earlier. Sarah Henderson proudly showed them the kitchen. "We have everything," she said, gesturing to the refrigerator, the electric stove, the washing machine. "And we're paying it off bit by bit. $20 a month for the appliances, $90 for the house, $35 for the car." Bauer's English was excellent, but he still asked Hoffman to confirm the translation. "She's saying they have monthly payments on everything?" "Everything," Hoffman confirmed. Jim Henderson seemed unfazed by the German economist's barely concealed alarm. "That's how it works now," he explained. "My dad saved for years. To buy anything. Me? I signed some papers and we moved into a furnished house with a new car in the driveway. Sure, I'm making payments for the next 20 years, but I'm living now, not when I'm 60. That evening, back in their Manhattan hotel, the German delegation held an emergency meeting in Bauer's room. Coffee and cigarettes fueled an argument that lasted past midnight. "This is insanity," Bauer insisted, pacing in front of the window. "We met a family today with 40 years of combined debt obligations. 40 years. The mortgage alone extends to 1985. What happens when the economy contracts? When factories close? When inflation makes those fixed payments unbearable?" But Klaus Richter was less certain. "We also met a bank officer who showed us actuarial tables. They've modeled this. The default rates are low. The math works if, and this is critical, if incomes keep rising and employment stays high. Exactly, Bauer said. If. We built our economy on if in the 1920s. I watched what happened when the IFs became no's. The Bundesbank representative, Dr. Friedrich Lange, had been quiet for most of the discussion. He finally spoke. Heinrich, I share your concerns, but we must be honest about what we've observed. These people are not desperate. They're not over-leveraged gamblers. They're ordinary families making rational choices within a system that encourages debt. A system, Bauer replied, built on the assumption that good times last forever. Werner Hoffmann stubbed out his cigarette and pulled out his notebook. Let's make this concrete. Tomorrow we're visiting department stores and meeting with consumer credit officers. We need to document exactly how this system operates at the granular level. Not our fears, not our theories, the actual mechanism. The next 3 weeks were immersion in the machinery of American consumer credit. They visited Macy's in Manhattan and watched customers open store charge accounts in less than 10 minutes. They met with executives from General Motors Acceptance Corporation, GMAC, which financed more car purchases than any bank in America. They toured the headquarters of Diners Club, one of the first multi-use charge cards, which had exploded from 5,000 members in 1950 to over 300,000 by 1955. The numbers accumulated in their notebooks, like evidence at a crime scene. Consumer credit outstanding in the United States, $31.4 billion in 1955, up from $5.6 billion in 1945. Mortgage debt, $110 billion in 1955, up from $35 billion in 1945. Percentage of American families owning their homes, 55% in 1955, up from 44% in 1940. Average household debt-to-income ratio, approaching 60% for middle-class families. In Germany, such numbers would have triggered emergency government meetings and central bank interventions. Here, they were celebrated as signs of prosperity. At a meeting with consumer credit officers from Chase Manhattan Bank, Bauer asked the question that had been gnawing at him for weeks. What happens when this stops growing, when families reach the limit of their ability to take on new debt? The banker, a confident man in his 40s named Richard Walsh, didn't hesitate. Then we refinance, we extend terms, we create new products. The economy doesn't stop growing, Dr. Bauer. We just keep finding ways to help people participate in that growth. With debt, Bauer said. With opportunity, Walsh corrected. A mortgage isn't just debt, it's equity, an investment. The house appreciates, the family builds wealth. That's the American system. We don't punish people for aspiring to better lives. The implicit criticism stung. Was Germany punishing its citizens with fiscal conservatism? Was stability just another word for stagnation? That night, Bauer wrote in his journal, "We had come to observe a slow-motion catastrophe. Instead, we found a carnival of easy credit. The Americans have convinced themselves that debt is not a liability but a tool. They speak of leverage the way we speak of savings. They treat future obligations as present assets. And somehow, impossibly, inexplicably, their economy grows faster than ours." But he added a final line. "The question is not whether this is working. Clearly it is. The question is, for how long?" July 8, 1955, Federal Reserve Bank of New York. 10 a.m. The vault door was 3 feet thick. As it swung open on silent hinges, Dr. Heinrich Bauer felt an unexpected sense of relief. At least some things in America were built for permanence. Gold bars stacked in careful rows, currency bundled and labeled. This was the foundation, the bedrock beneath the credit superstructure they'd been observing for weeks. Here, finally, was something German economists understood. Real assets, physical value, tangible wealth. Their guide, James Crawford from the New York Fed's research department, let them look for a long moment before speaking. "Gentlemen, what you're seeing is approximately $12 billion in gold reserves. This facility holds more gold than any other location in the world except Fort Knox. It backs our currency. It anchors the international monetary system. It's why the dollar is trusted globally. Werner Hoffmann studied the vault with visible appreciation. This, at least, made sense. Solid monetary foundations supporting the currency. "This is reassuring," he said. "We feared the credit expansion we've observed was built on nothing." Crawford smiled. "It's built on this, but it's also built on something more abstract. Confidence. Let me show you what I mean." For the next 3 hours, Crawford walked them through the operational machinery of the Federal Reserve System. It was a masterclass in modern central banking, and it forced the German delegation to confront an uncomfortable realization. The Americans had thought about this far more carefully than they'd assumed. The Federal Reserve, Crawford explained, was not just a bank. It was a network of 12 regional banks coordinated by a board of governors in Washington. Together, they controlled the money supply, set interest rates, regulated commercial banks, and acted as lender of last resort during financial stress. "We learned from the panics of the 19th century," Crawford continued, gesturing to charts showing bank failures before the Fed's creation in 1913. "When banks failed, depositors lost everything. Panic spread, credit froze. The entire system could seize up in weeks. The Fed was designed to prevent that." Dr. Friedrich Lange from the Bundesbank leaned forward. "And has it prevented panics?" Crawford's face grew serious. "Not perfectly. The Great Depression proved we could still make catastrophic errors. But since 1945, we've managed to smooth the economic cycle considerably. We've prevented the kinds of bank runs and credit collapses that characterized earlier eras." He led them to a conference room where economists from the New York Fed had prepared a presentation specifically for the German delegation. What followed was a detailed explanation of how the Federal Reserve managed the money supply and interest rates to influence economic growth. Open market operations, the Fed buying and selling government bonds to inject or withdraw money from the banking system, the discount rate, the interest rate at which commercial banks could borrow from the Fed, which influenced all other interest rates in the economy, reserve requirements, the percentage of deposits that banks had to hold in reserve, which controlled how much money banks could create through lending. It was elegant, sophisticated, and it operated on assumptions that made Bauer deeply uncomfortable. "You're saying," Bauer clarified, "that you intentionally create money, not through gold reserves, but through bond purchases, and inject it into the economy when you believe more credit is needed." "Precisely," Crawford confirmed. "And you're comfortable with this level of discretion? This much human judgment influencing the currency?" Crawford met his eyes. "More comfortable than we would be with rigid rules that can't respond to changing conditions. In 1931, the Fed raised interest rates during a depression because conventional wisdom said you must defend the currency. The result was catastrophic. We learned that monetary policy must be flexible, responsive, and willing to prioritize employment and growth, not just currency stability." Every word was a small explosion in Bauer's understanding of economics. The Americans were saying that money was a tool, not a master, that intelligent management could outperform rigid rules, that faith in technocratic expertise could replace fear of inflation. It was everything German economics had rejected after Weimar. Over lunch in the Fed's executive dining room, Klaus Richter asked the question the others were thinking. "How do you manage the politics? When you lower interest rates to stimulate growth, you're essentially making money cheaper. When you raise them, you're slowing the economy. These are political choices, disguised as technical decisions." Crawford nodded. "You're absolutely right. That's why the Fed is designed to be independent from political pressure. Our governors serve long terms and can't be easily removed. We answer to Congress, but we're not subject to annual appropriations or direct presidential control. The theory is that monetary policy is too important to be influenced by election cycles. Theory, Werner Hoffmann said dryly, often differs from practice. Crawford smiled. Indeed, we're not naive, but the structure helps, and so far, it's worked. That afternoon, they visited Chase Manhattan Bank to observe commercial banking operations. If the Fed was the brain of the system, commercial banks were its circulatory system, moving money from savers to borrowers, from deposits to loans, from static wealth to dynamic capital. The scale was staggering. Chase had over 5 million accounts. It processed hundreds of thousands of checks daily. Its loan portfolio exceeded $2 billion, spread across mortgages, business loans, personal loans, and the rapidly growing category of consumer credit. The head of consumer lending, a sharp woman named Margaret Chen, explained their approach to risk management. "We use statistical models," she said, spreading actuarial tables across the conference table. Default rates vary by loan type, borrower income, employment history, down payment size, and dozens of other factors. We've analyzed hundreds of thousands of loans. We know, within reasonable confidence intervals, what our losses will be. "You've reduced human behavior to mathematics," Bauer observed. "We've reduced aggregate human behavior to statistics," Chen corrected. "Any individual borrower might default unpredictably, but across thousands of borrowers, patterns emerge. Behavior becomes predictable." She showed them the numbers. Mortgage default rates below 2%, auto loan defaults around 3%, unsecured personal credit defaults near 5%. Within acceptable ranges, manageable losses, profitable even after accounting for defaults. Friedrich Lange studied the tables carefully. These models assume stable employment and rising incomes. What happens during a recession? Default rates rise, Chen admitted, but not catastrophically. During the 1949 recession, we saw defaults increase by about 50% across most categories. That sounds dramatic, but it meant mortgage defaults went from 1.8% to 2.7%. Painful, but manageable. The system didn't collapse. Because the recession was shallow, Bauer pointed out. What about a deep recession? A depression? Chen's expression became guarded. We have provisions for that. Insurance funds, capital reserves, and frankly, we trust the Federal Reserve to prevent depressions through monetary policy. That's their job. There it was again. Faith in management, faith in expertise, faith that intelligent intervention could prevent catastrophe. That evening, the delegation gathered in Bauer's hotel room for another late-night discussion. The initial shock had worn off. Now they were grappling with the implications. "They're not idiots," Klaus Richter said, flipping through his notes. "We came here expecting to find reckless gamblers. Instead, we found sophisticated risk modeling, careful supervision, and intelligent policy coordination. Built on optimistic assumptions," Bauer countered. "But not insane assumptions," Werner Hoffmann interjected. "Think about what we've learned. The Fed can inject liquidity during stress. Banks have modeled and priced risk. The government insures deposits and mortgages. It's not a house of cards. It's a carefully engineered structure." Bauer stood and walked to the window. Manhattan glittered below. Carefully engineered for perpetual growth. But engineering has limits. Physics has limits. What we've observed is a system that functions brilliantly when confidence and growth continue. But what happens when both vanish? Because they will vanish eventually. History guarantees it. Friedrich Lange, who had been quiet for most of the evening, finally spoke. "Heinrich, you may be right about the eventual crisis, but we must acknowledge something uncomfortable. They are managing risks we believed unmanageable. They have created institutional machinery we lack, and their economy is growing faster than ours because they've been willing to embrace controlled risk rather than absolute stability." The silence that followed was heavy with implications neither man wanted to voice. Had Germany's obsession with stability become an obsession with stagnation? Was there a middle path between Weimar's chaos and Bundesbank rigidity? Bauer returned to his chair. Then we must understand the full picture. The Fed and the banks are one part of this system. But there's a larger architecture we haven't examined yet. How America exports its credit system globally. How the dollar itself has become the foundation for international finance. That's where the real power lies. Werner Hoffmann checked his schedule. We meet with Treasury Department officials in Washington next week, and the IMF representatives the week after. We'll get our answers. I'm not sure, Bauer said softly, that I want the answers anymore. But they would get them anyway. And what they would learn would be more disturbing than the consumer credit carnival they'd already witnessed, because the machinery of American consumer debt wasn't just domestic, it was global, and it was built on a foundation that made even the gold in the Fed's vault look fragile by comparison. The willingness of the rest of the world to treat American promises as assets. July 19, 1955, U.S. Treasury Department, Washington, D.C. The conference room overlooked the White House. It was a deliberately impressive view, and the German economists understood the symbolism. This was where American financial power was managed. This was the nerve center of the post-war economic order. Their host was Under-Secretary of the Treasury Harold Carlson, a former investment banker who'd helped architect the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944. He was joined by 2 economists from the IMF and a monetary specialist from the State Department. Carlson got straight to the point. Gentlemen, you've spent 6 weeks studying American consumer credit and banking. You've seen how our domestic system works. Now we need to discuss how it fits into the international monetary framework, because what enables American consumer borrowing isn't just our banks and the Federal Reserve. It's the position of the dollar in the global economy. He gestured to a large diagram on the wall, a pyramid with gold at the base, the dollar in the middle layer, and other currencies at the top. This is the Bretton Woods system, Carlson continued, agreed to by 44 nations in 1944, operational since 1945. At its foundation is a simple commitment. The United States will exchange dollars for gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. Other currencies are pegged to the dollar. The dollar is pegged to gold. The result is a stable international monetary system built on American credibility. Werner Hoffmann studied the diagram. So the dollar functions as a substitute for gold in international trade. Exactly. When France trades with Japan, they can settle in dollars rather than gold. When Brazil needs reserves, it holds dollars. The dollar has become the world's primary reserve currency, the medium of international exchange, and the anchor of global finance. Heinrich Bauer saw the trap immediately. But that means the world is holding American paper, dollars, as though it were gold. What happens if they lose faith in that equivalence? Carlson's smile was thin. They won't, because we maintain convertibility. Any central bank can exchange dollars for gold at any time. That guarantee is absolute. But your consumer credit expansion, Bauer pressed, means you're creating far more dollars domestically than you have gold to back them. The ratio must be increasingly precarious. For the first time, Carlson's diplomatic composure showed a crack. The domestic money supply and international reserves are separate questions. We have adequate gold to back international dollar holdings. The consumer credit you've been studying operates within our domestic economy. But they're connected, Klaus Richter interjected, his voice rising slightly. American consumers borrow dollars into existence through bank lending. Those dollars eventually flow overseas through trade deficits. Foreign central banks accumulate those dollars as reserves. They're holding American consumer debt as though it were wealth. The IMF economist, a Frenchman named Michel Dubois, jumped in. Which is fine as long as the system maintains confidence. The Bretton Woods framework provides stability that benefits everyone. Europe is rebuilding. Japan is recovering. International trade is growing. The system works. Until it doesn't, Bauer said quietly. The meeting continued for another 2 hours, but the fundamental dynamic had been exposed. The German delegation spent the evening analyzing its implications. In his hotel room, Bauer drafted a confidential memo to the Bundesbank. His hand shook slightly as he wrote, "We have discovered something extraordinary and troubling. The American consumer credit boom is not merely a domestic phenomenon. It is underwritten by a global monetary architecture that forces other nations to treat American debt as wealth. Here is how it operates. American consumers borrow to purchase goods, many of them imported. These purchases create trade deficits, sending dollars overseas. Foreign exporters receive dollars, which they exchange at their central banks for local currency. Foreign central banks accumulate these dollars as reserves, believing them to be as good as gold because of U.S. convertibility guarantees. But the dollars being accumulated overseas are, in essence, claims on an American economy increasingly built on debt. The foreigners are funding American consumption, and they are doing so by treating American liabilities as assets. America has achieved what Weimar never could. It has convinced the world to hold its paper as treasure. Over the next 3 weeks, the German delegation met with officials from the IMF, the World Bank, the Federal Reserve's International Division, and several foreign central banks, maintaining offices in Washington and New York. Each meeting added another layer to their understanding, and each layer made the system seem more fragile and more brilliant at the same time. At the IMF, they learned how dollar loans were rebuilding Europe and developing Asia. American capital was flowing outward, but those dollars would ultimately return as claims on American gold or goods. The circle was closed, for now. At the World Bank, they learned how development projects in poor countries were denominated in dollars, creating demand for the currency regardless of American economic fundamentals. At a private dinner with a Bank of England representative, they heard quiet concerns about the long-term sustainability of American gold reserves. "They're running a trade deficit," the Englishman confided over brandy. "Dollars are flowing out faster than gold is coming in. Mathematically, this cannot continue forever. Eventually, they'll face a choice: devalue against gold or restrict convertibility. Either choice breaks the system. But when would that day come? And what would happen to the global economy when it did?" Friedrich Lange put it most starkly during one of their evening debriefs. "America has built an empire without conquest. They export paper, import goods, and the rest of the world considers itself fortunate to participate. It's extraordinary. It's also probably unsustainable. The question is the timeline." Werner Hoffmann had reached a darker conclusion. "I don't think it's accidental. The Bretton Woods architecture, the Marshall Plan, the development institutions, these weren't just generous policies. They were strategic choices that locked the world into dollar dependence, and that dependence allows America to run deficits that would destroy any other country's currency." "You're suggesting conspiracy?" Klaus Richter asked. "I'm suggesting intelligent design," Hoffmann replied. "Not every participant understood the full implications, but the architects, Carlson and his colleagues, they knew exactly what they were building. A system that allows America to export its inflation and import real goods indefinitely, as long as confidence holds." Bauer had been silent during this exchange. Now he spoke. "Whether by careful design or fortunate accident, the result is the same. America has discovered what no empire before it managed: how to make others fund your prosperity voluntarily. Rome taxed its provinces. Britain extracted wealth from colonies. America convinced the world to send goods in exchange for paper promises." He paused, then added, "For a time." That phrase, "for a time," haunted him. The mathematics were inexorable. At some point, foreign dollar holdings would exceed American gold reserves. At that point, any loss of confidence could trigger a run on gold that the US couldn't survive. The system contained the seeds of its own destruction. But when? Years? Decades? And what would the collapse look like? In early August, as their official study tour neared its end, the German delegation was granted a final high-level meeting with Treasury officials. Bauer asked the question directly: what happens when foreign central banks hold more dollars than you can redeem for gold? Carlson's answer was confident. We will ensure that day never comes. Through fiscal discipline, monetary policy, and economic growth, we will maintain the credibility of the dollar indefinitely. You're saying you'll manage your way out of mathematical inevitability? I'm saying that economics is not just mathematics. It's psychology, confidence, and institutional strength. The Bretton Woods system will endure because it serves everyone's interests. No one benefits from its collapse. Bauer wanted to believe him. The alternative was too disturbing, that they were watching a slow-motion crisis that would eventually destabilize the entire global economy. As they flew back to Frankfurt in mid-August, the 5 German economists compared notes and drafted their official report. The tone was careful, diplomatic, and deeply conflicted. The system worked. Brilliantly, in fact. American consumer credit had fueled extraordinary growth. The Federal Reserve had proven more adept at crisis management than German theory suggested possible. The Bretton Woods framework provided genuine stability for international trade. But beneath the success lay troubling realities. The system required perpetual growth and confidence. Any sustained recession could trigger cascading defaults that even the Fed couldn't manage. The international architecture made America's domestic credit boom everyone's problem. A dollar crisis would be a global crisis. Wealth was increasingly concentrated among those with access to cheap credit, while others faced higher costs or exclusion entirely. And perhaps most disturbing, debt had become the oxygen of American prosperity. The system didn't just allow borrowing. It required constant debt expansion to function. Stability through instability. Growth through leverage. Bauer's final note in his personal journal, written on the flight home, was prophetic. We came to witness a catastrophe. We found a miracle. But miracles, by definition, are not sustainable through normal means. America has convinced the world, and perhaps itself, that the rules of economic gravity can be suspended indefinitely through clever management. They may be right for a generation, perhaps even 2, but eventually the weight of accumulated debt will demand its reckoning. The only questions are when and how severe. The late 1960s arrived, and Heinrich Bauer watched from Frankfurt as strain lines appeared in the American miracle. By 1968, the mathematics were becoming urgent. U.S. gold reserves were falling, while foreign dollar holdings climbed. Vietnam War spending combined with Great Society programs created fiscal pressure. Inflation crept upward. The French demanded gold conversions openly. The system is approaching the crisis point we predicted. Werner Hoffmann wrote to Bauer in early 1968. American consumers kept borrowing anyway, because pulling back would trigger the very recession everyone feared. The crisis came on August 15, 1971. President Nixon announced the United States would no longer convert dollars to gold. The Bretton Woods system was dead. Heinrich Bauer, now 63, watched the announcement from his Frankfurt home. Everything Treasury officials had promised in 1955, that gold backing was sacrosanct, that the system would endure, had proven false. And yet, the world didn't collapse. The dollar continued as reserve currency. Trade continued. Credit expanded. The system adapted by breaking its own rules. Bauer realized his error. He'd expected a Weimar-style crash. Instead came transformation. The 1970s brought stagflation, soaring interest rates, and stagnant incomes. But Americans kept borrowing. Credit had become infrastructure, not choice. In 1983, a Der Spiegel journalist asked the aging Bauer, "Were you right? Did the American credit system lead to catastrophe?" Bauer's answer was measured. "We were right that the gold-dollar link would break. We were right about recurring crises, but we were wrong to expect a single collapse. Instead, The system experiences rolling crises, each resolved by expanding credit further, creating new instruments, new debt forms, pushing the reckoning into the future. That strategy has worked for decades, but it's also made the eventual reckoning larger and more complex. When the system finally breaks, and all systems eventually break, the consequences will be global, because the entire world is now inside the credit machine we observed being built. Heinrich Bauer died in 1989, months before the Berlin Wall fell. He never saw the 2008 crisis, the mortgage debt collapse that vindicated his warnings while demonstrating the system's ability to survive even catastrophic stress. His papers, donated to the Bundesbank archives, reveal prescient observations about debt-driven growth and credit as social control. But they also show something else: his recognition that economic systems must be judged not just by sustainability, but by human effects, the lives enabled, freedoms constrained, trade-offs demanded. The American credit boom created prosperity and precarity, opportunity and obligation, wealth and debt, all entangled. German economists watched with horror and fascination, warning of catastrophe while witnessing miracle. They were right about the risks, wrong about the timeline, and they asked questions we still haven't answered. What is the true cost of debt-fueled prosperity? Who pays? And how long can borrowed money and borrowed time endure? Consumer credit growth. In 1945, 5.6 billion outstanding in 1960, 56 billion outstanding in 1970, 127 billion outstanding. The expansion that terrified German economists in 1955 was just the beginning. Home ownership and mortgages. 1945, 44% of American families owned homes. Total mortgage debt of $35 billion 1960, 62% home ownership, $207 billion in mortgage debt 1970, 63% home ownership, $356 billion in mortgage debt. The 30-year mortgage that seemed radical in Levittown became the foundation of American middle-class life. Dollar dominance, 1960, 60% of global foreign exchange reserves held in US dollars. 1970, 78% despite the breaking of gold convertibility. 2000, 71% after decades of alternatives. 2024, 59% despite repeated predictions of dollar decline. The exorbitant privilege persists. Central bank evolution. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet in 1955, $48 billion, following the 2008 crisis, $4.5 trillion following COVID-19 pandemic, $9 trillion. The institution German economists watched with skepticism became the model for crisis management worldwide, for better or worse. Household debt-to-income ratios. 1950s, approximately 40% for middle-class families. 2024, approximately 110% median household debt-to-income. American families now carry debt loads that would have been considered mathematically impossible in the 1950s, yet the system functions. Academic and policy response. German economists of the 1960s-70s gradually moved from warning about the American model to studying it, then partially adopting it. By the 1990s, European central banking incorporated many Federal Reserve innovations. By the 2000s, European household credit was growing, faster than American credit. The system they came to observe and critique became the system they operated within. The crisis that proved them right and wrong. The 2008 financial crisis originated in American mortgage debt, the exact foundation of 1950s prosperity that German economists had warned about. Subprime mortgages, securitized debt instruments, and global financial interconnection created a crisis that nearly collapsed the world economy. Yet the system survived. Through massive central bank intervention, government bailouts, and unprecedented monetary expansion, the credit machine was restarted. Housing markets recovered. Debt levels eventually returned to pre-crisis highs. The Germans had been right that the system was fragile. They'd been right that crises would come. They'd been right that debt accumulation couldn't continue without consequences. but they'd been wrong about what collapse meant. Instead of destruction, there was transformation. Instead of abandonment, there was adaptation. The machine broke, was repaired, and continued running, now even larger and more complex than before. The question remains: the German economists who walked through American suburbs in the 1950s, who studied Federal Reserve operations, who analyzed Bretton Woods architecture, who watched families sign 30-year mortgages with mixture of horror and awe, they were witnessing the prototype of our entire modern economy. Prosperity through debt, growth through leverage, stability through perpetual expansion, power through currency dominance, social order through monthly payments. They returned to Europe with a warning disguised as analysis. This works until it doesn't. The question isn't whether crisis will come, but when, and whether the institutions built to manage it will prove adequate. We're still waiting for the final answer. The credit keeps flowing. The debt keeps growing. The machine keeps running. And the world economy remains, as it has for 70 years, dependent on the continuation of what German economists in 1955 called an impossible miracle. Perhaps impossibility in economics is just another word for not yet. Or perhaps Heinrich Bauer's final words to that journalist in 1983 remain the truest. The Americans were right that their system could function for decades. We were right that it contained fundamental contradictions. Both things are true, and both things remain true today.